Works of art have an unfinished character. There is always a space that you can fill. Today, I'm going to talk to you about Maurice Blanchot's The Space of Literature, which speaks of the triangular relationship between the author, the artwork, and the reader. Contrary to what we normally believe, that when we close the book we have finished, Maurice Blanchot argues the opposite, that every work has an unfinished character. The author tried to say something. He produces through the resistance of the medium, of the language, of the format, of the canvas, and we are somehow going to fill that hole to give it an interpretation. Every work is fundamentally an incomplete, unfinished project. Another important aspect analyzed by Maurice Blanchot is the solitude of the author. The author in any artistic format is faced with a blank canvas, a blank artwork, a blank page, a static instrument, and he has to overcome this resistance of emptiness and fill it with whatever he wants to put. And it is rare because the author somehow knows that his work is not going to be finished, because in addition to his communicative intention, there will always be the interpretation given by the reader, or the listener, or the one who is going to visit the theater, the artwork, the one who is going to see the painting or the photograph. This aspect is beyond the author's control. The author somehow has to bear this melancholy that everything he does to try to fill this void will invariably leave another void, which is the void of interpretation. What is the role of the reader? What is the role of the receiver of the artwork? Well, we have to finish the work. We cannot simply close the book and say this is what the author said and that's it, but we have to understand ourselves as an active part of the artwork. For us to be interlocutors of his words, of his intentions, we contextualize the content not only through the representation or interpretation that we give to his words, but to the contextual, historical, and contingent interpretation of our reading. Because we may be reading a book that was written in the year 1947, but we are reading it in the year 2023. That part of the interpretation is the fundamental role that the reader plays in finalizing or trying to bring closure to the unfinished nature of the artwork. In fact, it is also frustrating to think that our interpretation is not what is going to close the artwork, because our interpretation of the work can also open new conversations. The unfinished character of the work is intrinsic to the work itself, because it can always be open to future and new interpretations. And this also speaks to a fundamental character of language itself. Since language is a dynamic system that moves historically and produces relationships between meanings and signifiers and interlocutors that are determinant in a historical moment, the interpretation of an artwork can always be remade. We can watch a film every year and the interpretation we give to the film will be different. We can read a story today and read it 10 years from now. As we have changed, the interpretation is going to be different. But not only that, the world has changed, so the interpretation is going to be different. The story of Snow White can be told infinitely, but the interpretation given to the play or the story of Snow White is always going to be different. Here it seems interesting to understand it in this historical moment because neoliberalism, as the logic of capital and productivity, seeks the opposite. It seeks a finished artwork, which can be sold as a consumer product, as a work of consumption. I want to finish a book, have clear conclusions, close it, and move on to the next one. The consumerist logic goes against the fundamental, unfinished character of the work. Understand that a book does not have to give answers, but that a book should start conversations. It should allow that through the author's intention, through the artwork, in interlocution with the reader, is what produces a new interpretation and a new knowledge. But of course, this is not so convenient because nobody wants a book that can be read 1,000 times. What they want is 1,000 books that you have to read only once. Then, from the point of view of psychoanalysis, it is also interesting to think of the author as an unconscious subject. All voluntary communication has intentional and unintentional acts, and all involuntary communication has only unintentional acts. So, every time an author writes a work or creates a work, his communication is voluntary, which implies that he has intentional and unintentional communication. This unintentional communication is part of the work. And our interpretation of voluntary communication with intentional and unintentional meanings is often what produces so many different interpretations of the work we are reading. The author's creative intention is rarely fully embodied or tangible or materialized in the artwork he or she produces. Rather, perhaps, in a rather Hegelian sense, the purest form of the artistic work is in the intentionality of the author, in the way it was conceived, in how it was perhaps still abstract, but of course in rebelling against the material world and opposing and trying to overcome the resistance of the blank page, it has to solve these paradoxes and these antagonisms. And more, when an interpretation of the work is made, it refines, perhaps even resignifying the author's original intention. And also, as Hegel said, that the owl of Minerva always arrives late, so also our interpretation perhaps always arrives a little late to the author's intention. And perhaps what the author said had a contextual, historical, material significance of his context, his environment, his material relations, his reality. For us, it is already different. The unfinished character of the work also speaks of how difficult it is to understand a work as a very long historical process that takes place from the creator's intention, the resistance produced by the very creation of the work and its materialization in the real world, and finally, the multiple interpretations that we can give it. But this aspect of the work should not be at all negative. On the contrary, we should see it as one of the fundamental values of artistic works. This also puts us in an active role as consumers of art, and not passive ones. We are not observers because the work is not finished. We are participants in the work because the work asks to be interpreted.